Appreciate y'all being here. Sorry about last month. We just had a lot of folks that were at different conferences and stuff, so we'll push it all in today. With that, approval of the agenda.
Moved.
Second.
Seconded. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, motion carries. Approval of the minutes of February 12th.
Make motion approved.
Second.
Seconded to approve. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, motion carries. Director's report.
Have a couple of webinars that are available to all of you who would like to come. I believe it's next week, if I'm not mistaken.
Yep, the 17th.
17th. This one's on designing streets for the speed we want, and more or less about complete streets and building streets to fit the capacity of need and want. Also have I believe it's in your packet, a Planning Walkable Places quarterly update. And then we'll give an update on end of year balance.
Yep, I'm just here for your monthly update on where things stand with our projected estimate for our end of year balance this year for 2019. As of April 1st, we're at $410,000. You'll see it's about a $50,000 reduction from our estimate last month, and that was because we do get a final lockdown on our annual amount from Federal Highways. So we know with certainty the annual amount we'll be getting this year, and it did reduce our estimate about $50,000. So we'll continue to give monthly updates on where things stand through, I guess, through the end of August. Glad to take any questions.
Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Consent agenda.
Make motion approved, consent agenda.
Okay, all right. Moved, seconded to approve consent agenda. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, motion carries. Public comment. Anybody in the public like to address the? Okay, going. New business. Bylaw amendments, transportation, I think y'all have a copy of the bylaw agreement. It's kind of the points, changing the elections from February to July, election time frame commences in, to February from July, excuse me, and then we'll start that next year. No person elected as chair serve more than 2 consecutive terms. Officers remain at 1 year. Is there have y'all read through this? Do I need to go through it? Anything, other discussion? Any questions?
I have a question, Dan. So there's this one bullet in there that says one member of the executive committee can serve more than 2 consecutive terms. So I'm trying to figure out who is that? I mean, how do you decide which one that is?
Which one?
It's under the
Executive committee, 3 terms to be, 3 to be appointed in 2022.
the 4th bullet under policy considerations, and then the second little bubble.
Find it too.
I thought I was on that page, apparently I'm not.
That's not what I'm looking at. I'm looking at
no
page
member?
61, that one.
Oh,
Is it supposed to say no member?
it does say no
says-
member.
In
Mine
the,
says 1.
Okay, so the-
Executive committee shall serve more than 2.
it's just wrong in
Should
the
be no member.
no member, not 1 member. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, guys. challenged. Any other questions that I can't answer?
Wow.
That, and if there's no other questions, I'd entertain a motion to approve.
So moved. Second.
Moved and seconded. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, motion carries. Update 2019 ending balance options. Kristen?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I am here with a short update on where things stand with your options for any end-of-year funding we might have at the end of this year. Since our last meeting, I guess a couple months ago now, we've had a couple changes we want to make sure we share with you, and also want to go over the proposed decision-making process today. So you'll probably remember at the last meeting, we had whittled down about 10 or 11 candidate option categories down to the top 6 that was based on voting that had been done by your 2 advisory committees, your Transportation Advisory Committee as well as your Plan Advisory Committee. That's the group of people that are working on the update for the long-range plan on your behalf. So let's run through those real quick just as a reminder. So our first kind of option category was to put any funding toward the next activity that was needed to bring passenger rail to this region. The second one was technology projects. This was projects to extend the sort of technology network in our region. You've probably seen the big signs along the highways. The third option category was to pay off promised reimbursements early. This had to do with moving forward scheduled payments that were going to be made to projects that have already been approved in the future, to move those forward to this year. And then this fourth one was to contribute to Wichita Transit's capital needs, whether that was for vehicles or buildings, whatever, something, a capital need. And these 4 option categories, based on the voting, each received about 10% of the votes. It was between 8 and 10% for each of these categories, or option categories. And then these last 2 received about 15 to 20% of the votes. So these last 2 were sort of the highest vote getters. This one was to award additional funding to existing projects. This had to do with awarding funding to projects that were scheduled to let this federal fiscal year, to let for construction, to fund them up to the 80% maximum federal funding if their cost estimates warranted that. And then the last option was to contribute to purchasing right-of-way acquisition for the gold phase of the North Junction project. So since the last meeting, we have a couple updates on these. The first one is the passenger rail has dropped off. Since we first introduced this, we've heard from KDOT that they've been in conversations with several key stakeholders, including Amtrak, the railroad, to sort of reevaluate where things stand. I think Amtrak as a whole is reevaluating its service across our country. So we all decided, let's just put the brakes on this and wait until that reevaluation happens, and then we can see about that for the future. It just wasn't going to be a good fit for funding this year. And then the second thing that has changed is our ability to contribute to the North Junction right-of-way with this funding this year is still uncertain. We had heard no, and then we had heard yes, and at this point, I think KDOT feels pretty uncomfortable moving forward. So we do have a meeting scheduled this Friday at the end of this week, and I'm hoping we'll be able to get a little bit of resolution on this option. So we're going to be sort of moving forward with this, I think, until we hear differently, but just wanted to let you know that's still sort of a gray option. So within each of these 5 categories, there are 17 individual projects, and I'd call your attention to the handout in your packet. It looks like this, and there's a screenshot on the screen. You might not be able to read all the projects here. And in addition, in your packet, there's descriptions of these individual projects. And so we probably don't have time today because we have such a packed agenda, but I do encourage you to go through these when you get a chance. So you'll see under the additional funding. We've got 5 projects there. These are all projects that are currently in our TIP program to receive WAMPO funding. And for one reason or another, their cost estimates have increased and or they weren't already programmed at the 80% maximum. So they would be able to receive up to the 80% of the construction cost. You'll see the next category for the reimbursements. There's 4 projects there. These are also already in our TIP, already been approved for funding by this group. And this would be just to move forward the payments that were promised in the future, to move those forward to this year. We've got 6 technology projects on there. Most of these the purpose of them is to extend the regional network on additional corridors or to complete a technology project that we started in the last couple years. Here's the handout that has the specific descriptions of those projects. Next, we've got a multimodal capital project. Wichita Transit is in the design phase for. This would be to build a multimodal center at the site of the new baseball stadium on the west side of downtown Wichita. And then this last option again is to contribute to right-of-way acquisition. I encourage you all to review those individual projects. Hopefully some of at least the ones in the first couple categories are familiar to you because they've already been through our TIP process and been approved. We do have some folks in the room that can represent these projects if you have specific questions. And we also passed out, if you have specific questions that come up later, a contact sheet. Let me find it. That should be at your station that looks like this. And it's got contact information for people that are much more familiar with these individual projects, and they'd welcome your questions if you have questions about these specific projects as you're reviewing them. So in addition to the project summaries in your packet, we've also got a matrix because this, for many reasons, the amount of, we didn't go through the sort of the usual process we go through for funding projects. The amount of money is very uncertain and probably quite a bit smaller, and our timing is much more constrained. So we didn't go through sort of a normal ranking and committee process, but we thought this might be helpful to you as you're reviewing these projects to see how the candidate categories stacked up against our usual selection criteria that we use to bring projects into the TIP for WAMPO funding. And then I just wanted to close with some last steps, or the next steps. So we do have the project list pretty much confirmed, except for this North Junction one. We will plan to send out an email to the voting members of the board in the next few days that has all 17 projects listed. You'll be able to click on a link, see them listed, and then you'll be able to order them in your preference of priority from 1 to 17. Submit your vote. We'll tally up all the votes and take the average rank for each project, and then we'll present that to you at your next meeting in May for your final action. And again, these will serve as sort of the targets for what you would like any end of year funding to go to these particular projects. And then you'll also see these again at your August meeting, where the exact final dollar amount will come through as part of TIP Amendment 3 that you'll take action on at your August meeting. And then before I wrap up, just wanted to give a screenshot of sort of the funding breakdown that we'll be proposing for action at your next meeting. So we'll do the vote, we'll tally all the results, and we'll break out the funding, again, the targets this will be the funding breakdown that'll be presented to you for your consideration at your next meeting. And again, based on the results of your voting that takes place over the next few weeks. So we're hoping to have the voting open for about 3 weeks, so that will give you a chance to check in with your own governing bodies, talk to your constituents, research the projects, talk to who you need to talk to, and then be able to submit your vote in time to get get it wrapped up and presented to you at your next board meeting. You'll see here at the bottom, we do have a $100,000 set aside, and that's just to, that would be put to paying off the reimbursements, because that's the most flexible option, and it's almost guaranteed that the balance will change between July and October. So we hope to have a tentative lockdown balance in July, but it's most likely will change between July and October. So this amount would give us flexibility to make sure that we don't lose any funding that's released during this period. So with that, I'm glad to take any questions you might have on this.
And hey, and Troy, we could talk about this later, but the bridge over 159th, the turnpike, is KTA helping on that?
They're doing 80, right?
Okay, I didn't see that in the funding breakdown, but KTA is going to help?
It probably shows up on local on the spreadsheet. So that's probably kind of confusing. All right, thank you.
This discussion, Chris?
Thank you. So, first item I have to talk to you about today is a proposal to list our highest priority regional projects, essentially in our new MTP, in our new Metropolitan Transportation Plan that we're working on right now, to have a separate list that identifies the big projects in our region that are the highest priorities. So right now we only have in order for a project to be listed in our current long-range plan, it really only gets in there if there's a sponsor that has submitted them. So the sponsor conceives of the project, puts it forward, and commits to funding and building this project, potentially with some help from WAMPO. But it is really very sponsor-driven. And there's not really any prioritization. There's no saying one project is more important than any other. You're kind of either in the plan or you're not. And for certain types of projects, this works very well, but this does sort of put us at the mercy, particularly of KDOT, but also of the sponsors more generally, in terms of whether a project is going to appear in the plan at all. There can be something that is very important to the region that if no sponsor is ready to put it forward at the time we do the MTP, it's not going to show up in the plan. And then the lack of prioritization has caused some issues when WAMPO is asked to speak to, for example, the State Legislative Task Force or others and say what our priorities for the region are. We've sort of had to shoot from the hip when doing that because we have not formally identified what the most important projects are. So for the new MTP, what staff are proposing is that we will list these priorities explicitly to have a small number, 3 to 5, of the most important regional projects. And we're sort of assuming here that these are going to be very large projects, things that are, far beyond the ability of WAMPO to fund with our relatively small $12 million a year, projects that cost tens or hundreds of millions of dollars, but that are most important to our region. So why do this? Well, one thing that this will tie into is an issue you'll talk about a little later in our agenda. Phil is proposing a bucket approach for how we distribute the funding during each year of our new MTP. And one of the proposed buckets is called the highest priority regional project. And this would be a portion of the WAMPO funds that would be available to help with these very large, high priority projects. Again, these are too large. We don't expect to be paying for the entirety of a project like this using a small fraction of our relatively small amount of money. But the idea is we can use this money in this bucket to make high impact investments early in the project development process. Things like planning studies, acquiring right-of-way, maybe some early design work. Again, subject to KDOT restrictions, as we've just heard about with the North Junction, talking about the end of the year money. but to make those high priority early investments where a relatively small amount of money can have a big impact. And this list would be what we draw from when deciding how to allocate that bucket. But perhaps the bigger payoff, given the size of these projects, is to send a message to potential partners and funding agencies about what the region's priorities are. So when WAMPO staff talk to folks at KDOT, when all of you talk to to the state legislature or our federal legislative delegations, when we talk to FHWA and FTA, and in particular, when we or other folks in these regions submit to potential grant opportunities like the Build Grant or the Infra Grant, we can say this has been identified by the MPO, by the entire region, as one of the highest regional priorities or the highest priority in our region. And we've spoken some with the folks who, for example, have been involved with evaluating these big federal grant opportunities in the past. And this sort of official seal of approval from the MPO can make a difference in what projects get funded and what projects don't. So we think that this is a good opportunity to put the MPO's seal of approval on that and maybe put us in a little better spot when it comes to securing funding for some of these major projects. So we're sort of doing this in two steps. What we're doing today is asking for your help to create a potential list of candidates for this major regional project list. We've already talked to the TAC and to the Plan Advisory Committee, gotten their ideas. We'd like to talk to you today, sort of brainstorming what should we be considering for this list. And then between now and your next meeting, staff will put these three lists together, eliminate any duplicates, come up with some short descriptions of what each of these projects would involve. And then at your next policy body meeting in May, we would ask you guys to take this list of candidates and narrow it down to a small number, to 3 to 5 projects, and prioritize them so we can say these projects are the most important in our region. So really today we're trying to cast a broad net and look at everything that we might want on that list. And then, frankly, the difficult part will come next month when we're asking you to narrow down these potential projects that have been identified and truly prioritize what is the highest priority in the region. So, again, today we'd like to hear from you guys. What are the biggest priorities? What do you think we should be considering for this list? What do you want to consider at your next meeting to go on here?
Sedgwick County has already taken a position on this, and our major priorities in Sedgwick County in order are the North Junction, the Northwest Bypass, Kellogg going west out of Wichita, and Kellogg then going over into Butler County are our top 5 priorities, our top 4 priorities. And that's the order that they're in.
And I would concur with the last one, for sure. Going east into Butler County, there's going to be a pretty big issue coming up. So I would say that's a pretty high priority for us.
Who else? Anybody?
We would certainly support the North Junction, of course. I mean, that's our highest priority in terms of moving forward.
Yeah, we're really not trying to prioritize these today just to get them on the list. You can talk about what order they go in next month. Thought it'd be easier to get the broad list first and then narrow it down. So other potential projects that you'd like to consider at your next meeting for this priority list?
I have a quick question on those that are listed there. I assume those are further along than just throwing projects out there per se.
In terms of
study, construction, all of that.
These projects, certainly the North Junction is furthest along. The state is actually doing preliminary design on that as we speak, as part of the green phase project. They're working on preliminary designs for the later phases, which is what this would be. The northwest bypass is in the WAMPO long-range plan, but it is towards the end of the plan. I don't know that a whole lot of work has been done on that, at least recently. It's described in very general terms in the plan. Kellogg, going further east than what we have, what is being built right now, and going further west. Neither of those are in the current WAMPO long-range plan, and I don't know to what extent the city has done any specific planning for those, the city or KDOT.
Doesn't look like there's anything south.
And
We don't
I think,
hate to not have anything going south of Kellogg. There's a lot of people live south. So the 95th Street project that was done, Arc 95th Street, I think, something that needs to be on there for the south part of the county.
Yep.
This priority list is developed. I always get confused when group projects, they're in the queue, and then we want to come back and have conversations about priorities. Is this going to shift funding off of currently approved projects based on this new priority list? Or is this purely for discussion?
No, this is, at this point, purely to sort of set WAMPO's seal of approval on what these most important regional projects are. This will not affect, what is currently funded in our TIP, and it will not specifically allocate dollars to any of these projects in the next plan. It would make them eligible for the bucket that Phil will talk about a little later, but it doesn't specifically allocate funding to any of these. This is really more about saying what our priorities are, not about allocating money to them.
and also, folks, since we're going to have a more in-depth discussion on it next month, if you get home and think about it and come up with, oh yeah, I really wanted this project at least to be in the discussion aspect, be sure and get with Chris, because we can still add it. I mean, this is just, off, some of it, we're still thinking about, well, do we want that, or our governing body wants to add this or that. So don't feel this is an all or nothing one-time shot. We still have time to get information in and say, oh yeah, we want this added.
Yeah, that's part of why we want to do it in this two-step process.
Right. So,
I guess I would, oh, sorry, Tom, were you gonna go?
I just had a question. Go ahead.
I was just gonna say, something that was up earlier was about the maybe IT and messaging infrastructure that's already started going up. I mean, that's obviously a regional project, and it's not specific to Wichita and or whatever, it's everywhere. So I feel like that might be something that should always be in discussion.
Okay.
I was going to ask on the Northwest Junction, there was discussion about lane widening through there at the time when that process is put in place. I assume that's still part of it, so I'm going to leave that alone. But we ought to look at 254 too. There ought to be egress and acceleration lanes added to those intersections so people can get out and get up to speed, and they're not. So that ought to be a priority too. And I don't know about 96. I think there's a couple areas along 96 that are that way too. But then on the other side of it, we've done this twice, and we need to be consistent with prior lists and make sure that what were top priorities last time are still in this list so we have credibility. So.
One of the things that I'm hoping that we can continue to think about, even though I think KDOT is kind of pulling back a little bit right now on passenger rail, is making sure that is still at least an asterisk in the list. That's something that's going to boost all of our cities regionally, bring people in and out. So I think we need to make sure that it's at least mentioned or available.
I just think you ought to include the Northwest Bypass on this list.
If it's number 2.
It's on there, just scrolled off the top.
off the top of anybody's head that they want to add? If not, like I said, in the next week or two, if you think about it, jot it down, get it to Chris so we can add it and so we can bring it back as a more comprehensive list and have a bigger discussion next month. Sound good?
Yep.
you're still up, young man.
Yeah, it'll be a while before you get rid of me.
Yeah, I see that.
So shifting gears a little bit, when I was up here in February, we talked about how WAMPO was going to structure our projects list for the next MTP. And well, the board approved adopting a somewhat more flexible project list, a bigger menu that we will order off of when it comes to allocating funding to specific projects every 2 years as part of the TIP process. The board also said that they would like to see a more flexible amendment procedure for the new plan. So we have a easier time of addressing emerging needs, stuff that comes up between now when we're adopting the plan and 2024, when we'll be updating the TIP a second time under this plan. So what staff have come up with and are bringing back to you today is a amendment and supplemental project selection process. So we have an amendment process in Move 2040. It looks like this. Starts with the policy body member making a request, staff prepare an amendment, goes to the TAC for their recommendation. We go out to the public to get public engagement, get public opinion on this, and then we bring it to you for your approval. And we've used this 5 times so far. It has worked fairly well when it comes to non-WAMPO funded projects, changing out KDOT projects, for instance, that sort of thing. But where it has fallen down a bit is when it comes to changing, amending WAMPO-funded projects. And part of that is because we are trying to keep WAMPO funding in balance. So our policy has been, if you want to add a new WAMPO-funded project or add funding to an existing WAMPO project, we wanted to pull out funding from somewhere else. So essentially, if you want to put $1 in, you got to put $1 out. And this has kind of limited our ability to respond to emerging needs because no one really wants to give up their dollars for somebody else's project. In fact, the only 2 times that this has been used, it has been used by project sponsors that have more than one project and just moving money from one project to another. It hasn't really been used to address a new issue that emerges later in the process. So what we're proposing to do is, out of the $132 million menu that we talked about 2 months ago in February, what we will do is we would hold back 10% of that for later use. Essentially, this is the project to be named later projects in this case. So rather than doling out filling all $132 million of that list in the next 6 months as part of the MTP development process, we would fill about $120 million of it and leave about $13 million for later use. And then in 2022 and 2024, we would come back and run a miniature project selection process. Each time we would have about $6.5 million to allocate to new projects or existing projects to address needs that have emerged since the then past year of 2019, to address things that come up in the next 3 or 5 years. So the idea is that this $6.5 million, which represents 1 to 2 average WAMPO-funded projects, could be used for new projects to address emerging needs. So if something new comes up that we hadn't anticipated, we could add a new project using this money. Or it could be used to add additional funding to existing projects. Maybe we had something in the plan, identified it as a priority, but it turns out it's going to cost more than we thought it would. And we want to be able to provide additional WAMPO funding to that. Projects that would be selected under these miniature project selection processes would have to meet the same selection criteria as the MTP. With an additional criteria asking what has changed since 2019. What about this project is new or different? And the idea here is to make sure, we want this to be a way of addressing these newly emerged or late-breaking needs, not just as another bite at the apple for folks who didn't get funded the first time around. So really concentrating on what the policy body was concerned about, these things that are presumably going to come up in the next 3 years or the next 5 years that we haven't anticipated at this point. So Once we select these projects, we allocate this $6.5 million each time. We would amend these projects into the MTP, and then they would be on the menu and have the same opportunity to compete for funding as everything else on that menu when we create the new TIP, when we do our allocate funding to specific projects. So they would be on a level playing field, exactly the same as every project that's gotten selected up front. We would have the opportunity to fund, for these new projects would have the opportunity to compete for funding on the same basis. We would also plan on retaining the existing amendment process in addition to this, primarily to deal with those non-WAMPO funded projects. I mean, we just know from experience, KDOT is going to come to us on a regular basis and say, here's something that we need to get into the long-range plan. So we will have to have some other method for getting projects in if they don't involve the WAMPO funding. So we would retain that as well, primarily for the non-WAMPO stuff. So think that this would provide a degree of flexibility that we were lacking in the last plan. And by specifically withholding some of this money and essentially setting it aside, saving it for a rainy day, it would get around some of the problems we had of not having any funding freed up for these emerging needs under the current long-range plan. Questions?
I'm confused about the 13 million. And you said these projects could come up. Then you said that they are then going to be looked at the same as all the other projects. Is that only for the 13 million?
Only for the 13 million. So this is, I was just emphasizing that we aren't going to revisit everything that's already in the plan. Part of the reason for doing this is sort of to
Maybe
lock
more
those
than
in.
13 million that comes up, and then
Yeah.
they would compete for that 13 million.
Yeah, they'll compete for that 13 million, 6.5 million each time. The idea, though, is that they would essentially have to go through the same sort of process that all the original projects did. So it's not that these projects would receive any less scrutiny than the stuff that's going in up front, that's going in the next 6 months.
Have to have a plan sponsor also?
Yeah, it'd be essentially the same process. So we would put out a call for projects and say, hey, if anyone has something that has come up since we put it in the plan and is, has a need to get this in so it can compete for funding in, the next funding round, everyone will have the opportunity to put forth their project if they have one.
So how did you create the 10%? Did you just trim everything by 10%, or did you eliminate a project?
Well, we have not funded any projects. We have said we are going to allocate $132 million worth of projects. We haven't actually done that yet. That'll be something we're doing over the summer. So we'll just be allocating a little less than we would have planned.
Okay.
So it will make it slightly harder to get your project in up front because we're reserving this money, but nobody is on the list already that's getting anything pulled off.
Yeah. So I think this is a positive step based on what we've gone through the last few years. But an example, is there a way that a sponsor, if they had an urgent need, let's say something as drastic as the Tyson chicken thing that popped up all of a sudden and would have needed immense infrastructure and roads.
Mm-hmm.
So could a sponsor do something right away and kind of back apply for reimbursement?
I think we have, based on this is not a specific question that we have talked about KDOT or the feds with, but just based on some other related things, I think that they would take a very skeptical view of kind of back applying like that. The fastest, if we had a truly urgent need, setting aside, the feds are willing to waive rules, for example, in the cases of natural disaster or something like that. Setting aside those truly radical things. If you had an urgent need for like economic development, something like the example you gave there, the fastest we could probably get it into the into the process would be to, you get it in the tip and then move some stuff around from year to
Accelerate.
year.
Yeah,
But you're
accelerate.
still going to be, I think the limitation there is going to be the KDOT project development process, the amount of time that they take to approve things. And that unfortunately is not anything that WAMPO can directly do anything about. I think we can expedite our end of it as much as we can, and this is a step in that direction, but there's still KDOT and the feds to contend with, I'm afraid.
Right. Well, another glaring would have been all of a sudden like what WSU did out at the Innovation Campus. And so I know that sometimes the government agencies have the term speed of government, but this looks like the MPO process is not even as fast as the speed of government. So, all right.
If that project had already been through engineering and through KDOT, then it meets the 30-month time frame and would be eligible at that point. Because there are projects that people are looking at doing that they're doing the engineering up front and doing those things, knowing that they're going to need it at a future. So if that was the case and Pete's project had already been through engineering and KDOT had looked at it, then it could meet the 30-month project timeframe.
Well, in a way,
In theory, yeah, I think in practice, because of the extra cost involved in going through KDOT and meeting all the federal requirements, we don't see very many of our jurisdictions doing that speculatively, I'll put it that way. In theory, it could be done. I don't think I've ever seen anything like that done in our region.
Other comments? Discussion? So we need basically a motion to approve the amendment and supplemental project process, the modified version of the amendment supplemental project selection, and direct staff providing additional devising a revised amendment and supplemental project selection process. So,
I can ask one more question for you.
go right ahead.
So just to clarify then, setting the money aside does not take away, because it hasn't been allocated yet, does not take away from a project. A project just may be under more scrutiny to get into that because there's going to be 10% less
Yeah.
funding.
Else? Further discussion?
Move to approve the amendment and supplemental project selection process as presented.
A motion and a second. Any further discussion? If not, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Thank you. Okay, one more.
One more. So shifting gears a little bit, I want to talk to you about the vision, outcomes, and investment strategy for our metropolitan transportation plan. So why are we talking about this? Despite having these two very project-focused conversations just a few minutes ago, the MTP is more than just a list of projects. It's really the future that we're working towards in our region. And the vision and the outcomes are intended to define that future. Everything we do from this point forward on the MTP is going to be based on the vision and the outcomes. When we do project selection criteria, when we select projects, when we set policies, when we do the next 3 tips, all of the planning activities that WAMPO is going to undertake in the next 6 years are going to stem from the vision and outcomes in the MTP. And because these are so important, we have put a lot of effort into crafting these, and they're really built on 4 foundations. First one is the public engagement that we've been doing for the past 6 months. Really, everything we have been doing on the MTP since we started in these past half a year has been building up to this point, and a big part of that is the public engagement. So sent out thousands of emails, talked to hundreds of people at dozens of meetings, including this policy body, and got hundreds of comments on what the people want to see for the future of transportation in our region. And I have to say that Tricia did some excellent work in terms of entering and coding all of these. And based on that, there were really 8 areas listed sort of in priority order here that emerged from the public engagement. Active transportation, so biking and walking, highways, transit, safety, regionalism, funding issues, planning, which warms the cockles of my heart as a planner, and technology and automated vehicles. So these are what our engagement with the public identified as the most important aspects. Other foundation for this is all of the talk that we have been having here at WAMPO about trends. Over the past 3 or 4 years, we've had many guest speakers, we've had staff presentations, written reports, talking about these trends facing our region. And I've listed some of the big ones here, but we talked about many others. There's a link in the packet that goes to a lot of videos of many of these presentations. We also had our scenario planning process. This is something we did from 2017 into 2018. It had its own very extensive public engagement effort. We came up with our 5 scenarios looking at maintaining the current system, a scenario where we focus on demand for denser, more walkable development leads to the urban renaissance, a couple of funding-based scenarios looking at local transportation investment being required to replace declining state and federal funding, or if we don't, having to repurpose existing infrastructure as we do less with less. And finally, a scenario built around transportation technology like automated vehicles. And finally, the last one, and one we have not talked about quite so much with the policy body, is we're not doing this in a vacuum. There have been many other groups looking at the future of the Wichita region. And Kristen Zimmerman did a huge amount of work looking through these plans and organizing a meeting with the folks who created them, from like the Center for Economic Development and Business Research, the Chung Report, the Regional Growth Plan, Project Wichita, the Regional Economic Area Partnership, and the Community Investment Plan, talking about what sort of factors they see in the future for Wichita. And when we looked at all these plans, looked at where they overlapped, one thing that came up in basically all of them was concern about the Wichita region's lagging economy. Our economy is, by a lot of measures, not back where it was before the recession and has not been keeping up with places elsewhere in the country. So it's not really surprising that it's of concern to a lot of folks. And there's a lot of aspects of that, there's a lot of aspects that affect the economy. But one that keeps popping up in many of these plans is the idea of attracting and retaining talent. And this is one that came up in our trends work too. And as part of that, many things that affect whether people are willing to move here or stay here. But one that we can really affect with transportation is quality of place, essentially making Wichita a place where people, particularly the educated young people that we're having trouble attracting and retaining, really want to live. And the lever that we can use to do that is, like I said, this quality of place, really the intersection of transportation and land use. Looking at providing choices in transportation and choices of where you live. And that's something that we'll see is incorporated pretty heavily in the vision and goals. So the vision, to build a safe transportation system that increases quality of place and supports the economy of the Wichita region and South Central Kansas. So this, in a nutshell, is what we are trying to accomplish with our next long-range plan. Because that is such a short nutshell, we do have this series of outcome statements that we've drafted. They're each about a paragraph long, so I will not stand here and read all of them to you. But just to summarize briefly, looking at safety and health, which is focused on making our transportation system safer, whether it's accidents or pollution, health outcomes. The integrated multimodal transportation network, which is where we're looking at new transit concepts and how transportation interacts with land use. Expanding the economy through mobility, sort of the financial aspects. This covers both looking at sort of helping the economy grow through traditional freight movement, as well as making sure our transportation system remains affordable through managing our assets well and maintaining them, preserving them. Advancing equity and acknowledging diversity, looking at providing a transportation system that provides options for everyone, looking at regional transit options. And finally, getting back to talent, expanding the economy through quality of place to attract and retain talent. And this is where we're looking at things like providing denser mixed-use land use options. And really working on that quality of place aspect to attract folks to live in our region. So to boil all this down into an investment strategy, this is how we turn the vision and the outcomes into a statement of what sort of projects we are looking for in the next long-range plan. The Wichita region faces a future of changing demographics, generations, economy, technology, and land use that will demand new and different transportation solutions. To meet these challenges, WAMPO will balance preserving and maintaining the functionality of existing transportation networks and services with bold investments in multimodal connectivity and technology. So, sort of 3 pillars here: the vision, the outcome statements, and the investment strategy. And this is really going to set the direction for not just the rest of the development of the long-range plan, but for everything WAMPO does for the next 6 years. So, happy to answer questions about these.
Thank you.
Well, we are looking for action on this from the policy body.
Make a motion to approve the vision and outcomes as presented.
Second.
Moved and seconded. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, motion carries. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you.
Funding bucket proposal. Phil?
One of the things that we're concentrating on with this MTP is we want to change basically the name and the way we're trying to set up the MTP. As you have seen in the Move 2040 document, right now it's a 400-page, with the exception of the project list, it's about a 400-page doorstop. And we want to make it quite a bit more interesting, and we want to make it a little bit more readable and usable for the future. So some of the things we're doing is we're trying to rename it to a reimagined Move 2040, and we're trying to come up with different techniques and different ideas as to how we can make this a more usable document for the future. I think if I ask everybody in the room what you're going to build in 20 years, nobody's going to be able to answer that. So what we're trying to do is really follow what this region, being a microcosm of national trends. The fact on what we're seeing is what we could experience some of the most significant changes since World War II in demographics, land use, shopping choices, freight movement, housing choices, and lifestyle choices. As a result of these changes, we're trying to make a fairly clear assumption that no one knows, again, what you're going to build in 20 years or the transportation might look like. So what we're proposing for you today is to break that 20-year planning period into 4 distinct planning stages. And stage 1 would be slightly different since TIP projects have already been selected through the year 2022. So it'd start 2023 to 2025. Stage 2 would be 2026 through 2030. Stage 3 would be 2031 through 2035. And stage 4 would follow it up with 2036 through 2040. And over the course of our planning period, unless things change drastically and we don't see that happening, WAMPO will still receive about $12 million per year. And that goes towards regionally significant projects approved by the TPB. So all total from 2023 to 2040, we're looking at about $216 million in project funding. Recently, through project deobligations or project coming under other original cost estimates, we've had to develop programs to find ways to spend that money, and what Kristen talked about today and what Chris has mentioned today as well. The following proposal, again, is an attempt to diversify some of the project funding categories. And we're looking at helping you to expand our project listings by giving you other areas that you can place projects in. We can better meet funding criteria, in other words, regionally significant projects. We want to also do those projects that will improve safety, diversify mode choices, because we think there's going to be a lot of different things that change the way people travel, and using transportation products as a catalyst for economic development rather than just changing, I guess, to where transportation induces growth rather than growth creates a need for more transportation projects. Under policies, we've heard from 33 different public stakeholder groups, and we've talked to a lot of different people, just going from day to day. And what we're proposing is developing a list or series of buckets for each one of the designated planning stages. And those would include, as Chris pointed out, major regional priorities, preservation and maintenance of existing infrastructure, transportation options, including regional transit. Some of the things that are going on now is that people are talking to Wichita Transit about extended lines. That's going to be very difficult until maybe it becomes a regional transportation or regional transit agency. We're looking at technology projects. One of the things that are really, I guess, going to change the way we're looking at things is that we're looking at a 30% of vehicle fleet during this course of the planning period being automated vehicles or electric vehicles. And 30% doesn't sound like a very big total, but until you start talking about 30% of the vehicles registered now in our region, that constitutes almost 100,000 vehicles being electric or automated vehicles. So systems have to change and infrastructure has to change in order to come up with ways that we serve those different types of vehicles. We're also looking at a 45 to 60% increase in freight movements through this region. 80,000 pounds of load going through is going to have an impact on the roadway systems. We're also looking at active transportation and safety planning and development projects, because say that the new generations who are going to be making planning decisions are going to probably change the way people move. Also, what we're talking about today is proposals including the potential changing priorities. That's being able to move a project, as Chris pointed out, from one planning stage to another. If something comes up that's a real priority, say in 2023, and you've got it listed in 2036, the TPB can petition or can bring up in front of the body to move that project up. That means a project that probably would have to move down to another one because we only have so much money that goes with these proposals. Why are we talking about funding, different funding categories? And it's basically changing of the guard. Over the last 70 years, there's been two generations that have done the basic planning and infrastructure construction phases. That's the silent generation, born 25 to 1945, and the baby boomers, born 46 to 64. Over this 20-year planning period that's coming up, we're going to be looking at 2 to 3 different more generations who are going to be making planning decisions. We are definitely saying that the first phases of construction or the first phases of expenditures should be on preservation and maintenance of existing infrastructure. You've got a huge investment in infrastructure, and we need to maintain that. But you're also looking, according to the comprehensive plan for this region, about a $5 billion shortfall in revenues to expenditures or potential expenditures. And we need to look at ways that we can smarten the system and cut down that deficit. Based on the feedback we've received, and based on the fact that we're having an aging population, anticipated land use, shopping changes, those kinds of things, we are going to be looking more at a fully integrated multimodal transportation system. And these buckets, again, are intended to give you, as policymakers, more of an opportunity to kind of pick and choose at different categories that might be changing and might be becoming more important over the 20-year planning period. A lot of this has been covered, but basically these are the responses received online and through some of the questionnaires were filled out. You can see that planning and balanced investment were the top two categories. A regional focus was also there. Road improvements, technology, the infrastructure maintenance, and accessibilities made up those. But the top two constitute about 62% of the responses we received. These are also including kind of the workshops that we had with TAC and with this board. I'd like for you to keep in mind that these numbers are completely hypothetical. We just filled in the blanks to show you what could take place in terms of allocation of funds over these 6 different categories or 6 different buckets. And we started out with putting about $3.6 million towards regional priority projects because it's going to take quite a while to go through environmental, go through design, to go through right-of-way acquisition, those kinds of things. It's going to be, those projects usually take a good 10 years to get going. Preservation and maintenance, about $24 million out of the $36 million first initial investment. And then the transportation, technology, freight preparation, and those received a little bit, or some additional monies. Freight projects because we need to prepare for things like spurs, railroad spurs, improvements to highways, maybe some inland ports or those kinds of things, was also given some additional funding. Stage 2, you can see the money for regional project goes up a little bit, but again, the lion's share goes to preservation and maintenance, and that's through the year 2030. Stage 3, again, the increase in regional priority projects that's when we anticipate the majority of those will go through all of the planning phases and will be ready for construction, so there's more money available. Again, preservation and maintenance gets the lion's share of the money of $32 million. Stage 4, a growing share goes to regional major priorities projects. You're also looking at, again, a fairly good share going to preservation and maintenance. All the other categories are going up. But over the course of from 2023 to 2040, 18% of the monies we're saying should go to priority projects. 54% of the money should go to road and bridge preservation and maintenance. 6%, goes to regional transit. 6% goes to ITS or technology projects. 9% goes to freight, and 6% goes to active transportation. Again, these numbers are totally hypothetical. You're the ones who set the final totals, how we go, or the number of categories, or how it's proposed to be implemented.
Bill, can I ask a question on
Sure.
this real quick? Not to stop you, and well, I am going to stop you midstream. So it almost sounds like what the proposal might be is that we come up as a body with percentages that we're going to shoot for in these different buckets prior to us choosing which projects are going to be part of the next planning phase. And I guess in my mind, I find that interesting, but I don't think we should limit ourselves by putting buckets up that are imaginary numbers that we're going to come up with. And therefore, if we come up with a project that might not fall in or falls into a bucket that's already used up based on the percentage, well, now it's no longer in the list, even though it might be a priority for us. So I guess in my mind, maybe I'm understanding this incorrectly, but I feel like if we do go down a road of allocating specific dollar amounts, because we don't have $12 million a year. It's not like we have $1 billion a year we can really play with. This is a little bit of money, really. So I just feel like if we're gonna try to bucket this, I wouldn't be for that if that's what the end game of this proposal is.
Well, priorities are going to change, and the dollar amounts are going to change from one 5-year planning period to the next. If you have a project that, let's say a technology project, and the money isn't allocated, it can go to another bucket, or the board can say, we'd like for the money to go from active transportation to
Then why
another
even have
fund.
buckets at all?
Excuse me?
Then why even have buckets? If
It
all
gives-
that would happen is we say, oh, well, we have extra money, we're just gonna throw it wherever, that's what we're doing anyway.
It gives you the opportunity to come up with different project lists, because right now, at the end of the year, we have money left over usually. And what we're trying to do is give you a little bit more opportunity to break those funds into different buckets, because things are going to change so rapidly. Technology is going to play a bigger role. We're thinking that not everything is going to fit into the two major categories that we have now of road and bridge preservation, or maybe some hike and bike trails, or those kinds of things. We're trying to give you some ideas to where you have more flexibility to where you need to spend or want to spend. And these buckets could change, but we've basically set up the buckets on what we've heard from stakeholders in these public presentations that we make.
I wonder if the percentages or the buckets, the naming of the buckets is really just, here's what all of our projects are probably gonna be. But not necessarily that we need to, again, limit ourselves by saying, we're gonna shoot for X number in these buckets, because really, I mean, I feel like it's all just made up numbers anyway. Even if we spent a year trying to figure it out, next year we suddenly have 10 other projects from other places that's going to go in the long term that have nothing to do with those. So I don't know. I guess it seems like a lot of work for something that I think limits us and maybe isn't necessarily necessary for this body anyway. Maybe if it's the city or the state or something, maybe it's different. But that's just my opinion. So that's my take on it.
I guess if we don't do something, we're going back the same way we are now. Several millions of dollars being put out there for projects, and then we just make the presentations, and if there's a technology project, it goes in with all the other road and bridge projects. We also know there's going to be, we could eat up all of the money basically just through road and bridge or preserving maintenance. So I guess how do you then decide what becomes more important on the technology or the road and bridge? So I think we need to move away from the way we're doing it now, for one, and truly break funds down so that we know there are other ways and other projects that can be truly funded. I see that, and I know your percentages are probably just made up percentages, and that's to be determined by the board basically looking at the amount of funds that may be available out there. I think we need to move, the stages are one thing we need to move away. If we do right now we do 2040, everything's thrown into 2040. You have no ability to move it from one year to the other years at this point. We need the ability to move those from year to year, especially if priorities change on a project that's out there. Just like one that Pete may have. Well, that may be a project that really needs to be done. If you're just throwing it in with all the projects, it won't move. So I think we need a different way of doing than what we're doing now.
So what we're doing now has been a problem. I guess I've been on this body a couple of years now, and I really haven't seen where it's been a problem that we have to fix something. And maybe I'm missing something, or you have a different take on it, obviously. So I guess to enlighten me a little bit, what is the problem with the way we're doing it now?
It's not necessarily fixing a problem, it's preparing for the future, because you have the millennial generation does not want to travel the same way that baby boomers want to travel. Alpha generation is going to take over in terms of numbers from the millennial generation as early as next year. And it's starting the planning process now for trying to develop how we respond to trends, how we respond to empirical data, how do we respond to the changes that are going to take place. everything right now is car-centric. It may not be the same way in 10, 15 years.
Okay, I completely agree with that. And as an individual city, as we come with what projects or county or other entities we come up with, what we individually are going to attack based on all the great information, by the way, that we've seen, doesn't necessarily translate into this body needs to come up with buckets we're going to put this money in, because Wichita is going to have a completely different mix than Andover and Derby and everybody else. And as they come up with their projects, and they put them in for the MTP, I guess I don't feel like I might be the only one here because I'm the one talking about it, but I feel like if we bucket this thing, then we are going to completely remove all the flexibility, because now you've got a ceiling for every single type of project you could possibly have. And then if nobody has a technology project, then what happens? We got to go back and talk about it again and how that money could be moved. Or if we have way too many of maintenance projects, because that's just what needs to happen for the next 5 years. Now we got to go back and talk about it again and adjust our percentage. I don't know. I feel like it's an exercise in normal way that government works, where we come up with all these regulations that aren't even needed. Not that you're a government entity, but I appreciate all the work you've done on this. But I don't
Trying
know.
to get
I
away
guess
from
I'm
that.
completely unsold on this. So.
Troy, I think, I've watched this now for my 5th year, and it seems like this has been the challenge that this board has had since the very beginning of how to select projects. And then once they're selected, with this requirement that we got to look so far down in the future and allocate these projects. And then, yes, sponsors come forward, they get them in the queue, something may happen. And there's been situations, how do you reallocate if something falls out? Is that a county to county decision? Can they move it city to city? Or if it falls back in the general bucket, does it go back up for allocation to the next one in queue? And I've watched us go through selection criteria that we use until it runs into a barrier, and we want to rewrite the selection criteria so that it kind of fits. And what the one word that keeps coming back over the whole time I've watched this is the flexibility to put these plans in place, but then not have the board so restricted by guidelines that if money's going to move around, it can move around easily. And I don't disagree with you with the buckets that they're talking about, as long as, again, those buckets are a way to give an allocated amount to each project type for planning purposes. And as that is looked at, then it can easily, if there's no technology projects, it shouldn't be a massive problem for the board to say that $1 million freed up and it can now overflow into these other buckets with no difficulty. I think where we struggle year after year is with the requirement to have long-term dollars allocated in placements, is how do you, whether it's this now having 10% set aside, all these things they talked about today, I think are all kind of going to the same end, is to have money that frees up, can be easily reallocated. But as these plans are done, there has to be some criteria, in my mind anyway, that you could use every bit of your money each year on simply infrastructure. There's just no way you could, so you've got to have a way, in my mind, and I like what you're trying to do, is to allocate it out, whatever those percentages are. And then as we come to review it each time, those that have technology need to know at least there's going to be a competitive bucket, if that word doesn't change it, that they can compete for.
I think we are going to have to be more involved in this process as a body, because it's going to come to you every 5 years. Instead of a 20-year plan totally out there, you're going to see these again every 5 years, and you're going to need to make the decisions on those projects going in to those on a 5-year basis. You may move it from the second 5 years to the first 5 years, but it actually gives this body more input into the projects and the long term is what it does. We've truly not been involved in picking projects as this whole body and what is done. We've allocated that to 4 or 5 people. The next thing comes back and we just kind of, yeah, that's a good idea, and go there. This truly makes us become more involved in the process.
I think staff will substantiate the fact that since I've been here, the whole goal is to give you more ownership in picking projects, selecting the dollar allocations, and how we move forward with this. Because we could come and say, we're going to spend this much money on this project. And it may not be what you as a body want, but we're trying to give you more ownership in the whole detail as to of how we get to where we're going. And again, I don't think anybody can tell me what they're going to build in 20 years. So what we're trying to do is break this down into manageable stages to where you have a better idea of what money's available, what can be spent, what might have to be reallocated, and we're trying to give that ownership to you all.
So I've only been on this board for a little over a year, so I don't have the perspective of this, but I like the blocks of planning years. That makes sense. And I actually like the buckets. I have a concern, and let's see if I can articulate this. Let's say we have projects that come in, and in one bucket, there are maybe not as many projects. And so, but because we have that bucket, we feel like we have to allocate to those projects that when we look across the buckets, those two projects or however many there are, that few aren't as important as something else in another bucket. I don't want us to be stuck in this, okay, well, we have that bucket, so we're going to have to spend money there when we know we should be spending money in this other bucket. That's my concern.
I don't think that's what you're presenting. I think if if there's $100,000 in the bucket, 50,000 comes in, I don't think we have to say, yeah, well, we only spent 100,000 in there.
But what if
We truly-
100,000 comes in and we recognize that that's not really how we ought to be spending our money? You know,
I think
these.
that we truly have the flexibility to move them from one to the
Okay,
other.
and that's what I would want, is that flexibility to know, okay, so we said, you know, preservation's gonna be 60%, well, that's probably not a good one, because that probably will be, that could be 100% actually. But let's say one of the 6% buckets, and we get 6% of the projects in there, but we look at those and go, well, no, that money ought to be spent over in this other bucket. Those aren't as, and I don't want, the originators of those projects to think, well, I made a proposal in that particular area and we haven't spent all that money. I should get that funded. And that's not, I don't think how we want to look at it, is that those are set percentages, and if we, you know, that we have to spend the money that way.
I think that's information needs to come back to this body to make that decision.
Yeah.
And if, in the past, basically, we'd have been done with it, we'd have had no say, we'd approved all the big projects and we're done.
Yeah.
This way it comes back to us and that project can say, well, you look at these technology, they shouldn't be done. We ought to take some of this money and move it to the road and bridge that ought to be there. That gives this body the flexibility to do that.
And I think you're right, Bruce, this makes us more involved in it. And I think that's a really good thing, because a lot of times I feel like what came from the TAC, okay, they've looked at it, I should approve it. So I think this would give us more responsibility and flexibility.
And the last piece I would add to your point is, there's still going to be the level of requirement of each of the sponsor all the way through to have a certain level of criteria that makes your project even qualify. So as long as we don't abandon that and then try to use the body to decide every dollar allocation, then that's how you control that $10,000 when it gets there. It's a legitimate $10,000 need based on the criteria that we have set for project approval.
One scenario that I'd throw out there, because the bucket idea does intrigue me, but I understand what Troy's saying as well. The city of Wichita, we are big enough. We could probably go through and pick some very legitimate projects out of every single one of the buckets. And if I almost feel like, and I know this sounds counterproductive for our interests, but as the group as a whole, I can see the city of Wichita applying or putting some very legitimate projects in every single one of the buckets and eating up way more of the money than this body as a whole is probably comfortable with, knowing that everybody has needs. Just speaking strictly about technology, just because it's brought up. You know, we have some tremendous technology concerns and things that we could spend legitimately that would be regionally significant. but we probably don't apply for right now because it's not necessarily, so my concern is for the body as a whole, is that the city of Wichita, I just happen to know where we're, like all of you guys, we're looking for money in every bucket around the state. And my concern would be is that we would, for this body as a whole, that we would eat up a tremendous amount of money, and this should be spread around.
That doesn't mean
And
you're
I
gonna
think-
get them all approved.
Right.
You may could submit them.
Get it.
They may not meet the criteria. There may be a cities that says, hey, ours is more important than the city of Wichita's. That's where, yeah, we all could fill the buckets and run them over. But just because that you're submitting it, doesn't mean it's gonna get funded.
Yeah, and I think
I
this
absolutely
board has
agree.
done a pretty good job over the years of prioritizing because if you look at the spread, I mean, it's been pretty well between Sedgwick County, the city of Wichita, and the small cities. There's been a pretty good mix of, trying, even though we realize, Wichita is the big economic engine, but still the projects in the smaller communities and the outlying areas are also significant regionally. And I think this board has done a very good job over the years to spreading that money around and been very conscious of that. And the city of Wichita and Sedgwick County, even though a lot of money comes from them, has been very conscious of making sure that the other communities are taken care of too.
James is just trying to
Just-
protect that.
Well, yeah,
That's
and
what he's
I
trying to
just,
protect.
I fear that we're gonna have money left over in a bucket, and Wichita's gonna come up with a project that meets all the criteria. Well, you're gonna have projects that other people are gonna want to fund. How are you going to tell the city of Wichita, sorry, city of Wichita, even though you qualify, and even though your project is gonna help the region, how are you gonna tell the city of Wichita no? Because there's a bucket there specifically for that purpose.
The way we do now.
So,
We do it
Same way
now.
we do
then
now.
I would
You don't
have to
get all
concur
your-
with
You
Troy.
don't get everything funded.
Well, I would have to
basically.
concur with Troy, then we're going back to the way we're already doing it now.
I don't see that.
What's the point of the buckets, I guess?
Bob, you had something you wanted to add?
Approach when I participated in the Des Moines area MPO process, and that was for probably 15 years. And what I found is that it became very difficult for some of the reasons that are talked about here. Good intention, if you said these are $100,000 in a category. And so they would make sure that they got all their applications. And it was hard then to say that there was a bike project, and this really happened mostly in our case with bike pedestrian projects, but there are other categories where you could do this as well. We would submit, made sure that our project met minimum qualifications, and then we would fight at the table forever to keep our project. And what it does is doesn't allow this body to have meaningful conversations regarding the importance of my bike project versus extra money for projects move the needle in a way that you think. Maybe some years that because of autonomous vehicles, all of us is that we have predictability, right? So that all of us know what we should be including in our capital improvement program. And have funding we can rely on going forward. I like the idea of 5 years, 10 years down the road. But I just want you to know I watched this system play out in a way that I don't think was very good. And in fact, it got gamed so badly in Des Moines that cities would trade votes. And so they would call around and they'd count enough votes to be able to get their project and keep it, or to actually have, the trade, I'll vote for your project if you vote for my project in another category. And it got really political. So anyway, just a little bit of experience that I had with the bucket approach.
Okay, other comments from the board? What do we want to do, folks?
Is it a concept that you're wanting approval for, or just a concept?
Yes.
Make the motion that we approve the concept presented. Second it.
Who's the second?
Likewise.
Yeah, okay, so we have. to
Discussion?
approve- Yeah, we're gonna get to that. We're gonna motion and a second and Bruce to approve the concept of this. Okay, now discussion. Cindy?
Okay, so that means this idea of planning stages and buckets. Okay, and not setting percentages. Okay, thank you.
Clear to everybody? Further discussion?
Yeah, I have a question on that last thing. What is not setting percentages today, but sometime in the future? Or,
What happened in the future, but it's gonna have to come back for us to decide that.
but eventually there will be percentages according to the concept.
That's the concept. Yeah.
Okay.
The clarifications? All right, all those in favor of the proposal, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. We're probably gonna have a hand vote on this one for Bethany. Aye. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Okay, opposed? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Is that what you came up with? Can I add? Okay, so it's approved, 10 to 8. All right, thank you. Moving on. Executive committee did not meet in the last time frame, so we're going to pass. Tom, do you have a TAC report?
TAC, we have 4 this month, so we can.
Partnership, look, anybody, well, we don't have Tom or Mike. Anything? All right, any other business to come before the board? If not,
One comment. I know the vote's been made, but I think just what I would ask for is to go forward in support of those that voted one way or the other, is that this is, the idea that the motion was a concept. I think when we go forward, this obviously is enough discussion when we start moving money or talking about moving money from one bucket to the other. If this vote caused that discussion to happen at this board, this was a good vote. If all of a sudden we find a percentage and then we're right back to what you're talking about where someone's protecting a pool, then the vote really didn't get us anywhere. So the idea of the concept in my mind is what I think this board has to really respect out of this, because it's not authority to set up a percentage of buckets and then we're trying to work through that. So that's just my view of what we just did.
good point, thank you. Anything else? I agree. Not, we stand adjourned.